Yeah, we can start right now. I wanted you to a little bit work on the organization part by explaining a bit of the Oikot, what is it? And then we can start right away.
I'm just very briefly, I'm going to share on
Yeah.
Oikotree, right? Okay, friends, thank you, moderator, and all the friends across the globe. And we welcome you all for this virtual meeting. Before we move into the activity, Covideconomics for an economy of life and climate change, very briefly, we would like to update on Oikotree. Oikotree is a community of movements that includes church-related groups, social justice movements, secular groups, faith-based organizations, and individuals who are challenged on a daily basis to live faithfully in the context of empire and are striving together for justice in the economy and the earth. The main goal of the Oikotree community is to challenge and resist militarized economic globalization through struggles or transformative system change and a commitment to the promotion of lived out life enhancing alternatives of caring economies in communities. The struggle towards this goal is inspired by a faith based imperative of God's call to justice for those who are impoverished and marginalized by systemic injustice in the economy and God's call to seek justice and care for the earth. Groaning in pain due to human activity. Oikotree and other social movements that connect with these ecumenical efforts are key bridge builders to deeper social analysis, activism, solidarity, partnerships, and people struggles. Oikotree as a movement initiated by three largest ecumenical institutions, the Council of World Mission, the World Communion of Reformed Churches, and the World Council of Churches, which struggle to dismantle an empire that are produced an unprecedented economic and ecological crisis in our times. In a very short, the vision of Oikotree has been envisioning a world of justice and life flourishing communities and caring of our earth. And the mission promoting and living out life flourishing alternatives in communities. Oikotree as a forum began somewhere in 2005, 2006, continued with several global forums meeting, and finally they came out to different task groups in the Oikotree called the Oikotree Facilitation Group. The moderator of the Oikotree is Reverend Professor Dr. Sawma. He is from South Korea. He is also the convener of the Transformative Education Working Group. We have Professor Dr. Susan Davis. She is a theologian, feminist, the convener of Transformative Theology Working Group. Dr. Rogate Mashana, economist from Tanzania, convener of the Research and Analysis Working Group. Reverend Dr. Omega Bula from Zambia. She is the convener of Life Enhancing Agriculture Working Group. And me as Stanley being the convener of the Joint Struggle Working Group. And Carla Nathan from Indonesia. She is the convener for Youth Empowerment Working Group. And Reverend Christopher Rajkumar is the convener of Networking and Communication Working Group. These are the few names, but of course, there are a lot of members part of this process of each task group enabling Oikotree to move forward. So I will leave this in a small way to describe to you, but you can always visit Oikotree website, www.oikotree.net. I will leave now to Rogate to moderate this program. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you very much, Stanley, for that briefing of the Oikotree. And we encourage and invite others to join the Oikotree actually. And now I'm very happy to have all of you here for in this room of the World Social Forum on this topic we have of COVID economics for an economy of life and climate justice. I'm happy to have that the speakers are here, and I would like just to go through the speakers in order to introduce this to the participants who are in this room now. Ms. Rosaria Guzman. Rosaria Guzman is IBON Executive Editor and Head of the Research Department. She is also a member of the IBON Board of Trustees. She's from Philippines, and she will speak on inequality in a time of pandemic, perspectives and proposals from the global South. And then we have Dr. Justin Hacker. Dr. Justin Tucker is the Director of Church Action for Tax Justice, UK, a program of the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility. He has a background in medicine, international development, and theology. He is the author of Global Poverty, a Theological Guide, and has published articles on the intersections of ethics, theology, economics, and development. Prior to becoming a theologian and a tax campaigner, he worked in international development as a pediatrician in Kenya. He will speak on In a Time of Pandemic, Tax Justice Now. And then we have Dr. I will say only Dr. P. Curve because of the the long first name. Dr. Priya Curve is the convener of the Indian Network on Ethics and Climate Change. Addressing climate change is a collaborative effort to find out how you can help enhance our efforts in resilience to climate change. She is actively involved in international organizations working in the field of renewable energy, equitable sustainable development, pro-poor carbon finance, etc. She's also teaching courses on sustainable development, climate change, etc. at Symbiosis International University. She's an Indian physicist and inventor, and she's currently the managing director at Samuchit Envirotech PVT Limited, in short set, Pune, India. Her work has been honored by several national and international awards, including World Technology Award 2005 by World Technology Network, New York. She will speak on the pandemic and climate change, lessons for climate justice. We have again Reverend Joy Kennedy. Reverend Joy Kennedy worked at the Canadian Council of Churches, currently involved in Canadian Interfaith Fast for the Climate Canada, a climate justice activist. She will speak on building back better for a more climate justice world. We are very happy to have you here with us, and we hope that with this session, we are going to have a good input into Covideconomics, as we all know that it has affected basically human and economic problems around the world, especially the vulnerable groups around the world. And the idea of having this forum today is to discuss about to analyze the whole situation together through these presentations, and also to come up with proposals of how we can go forward with having brilliant ideas of how we use the opportunity of this COVID for a new and alternative system that will then help the vulnerable groups and also save our environment, save our ecology, actually, so to say. Therefore, I shall give 10 minutes for each speaker. We shall first of all take two speakers, and then a discussion, and then the next two, and then discussion, then we wrap up. That's how we are going to go now. So I will like to welcome now our first speaker, who is now Rosario, to start presenting in 10 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Rogate. Thanks for inviting me, and it's nice to see everyone here in this virtual room. I won't mention anymore one by one, but I missed being with you, physically being together again. But anyway, okay, the agenda, right on the agenda. Actually, the severity of inequality has never been starker during the pandemic. And this may be witnessed in two major ways: in how easily incomes and livelihoods of the majority poor have been wiped out, and in how government response to COVID has only prioritized the elite. This is my perspective coming from the global south, and there is no better case to make my point than our very own experience under the Duterte administration. The Philippines has the largest economic contraction among its neighbors and third among 25 countries in South, East, and Southeast Asia. The World Bank notes that the Philippines will have slower recovery than the rest, and Moody's Analytics looks at a darker scenario. The country will be the last to recover in Asia Pacific and not just among the ASEAN, and this is yet to happen by the end of 2022. The main reason for this worst economic collapse, I should say, and protracted recovery, apart from our basic crisis of underdevelopment and 4 decades of neoliberal globalization, is our government has given a paltry for COVID response and economic stimulus. The Philippines has the smallest fiscal response to COVID in Southeast Asia, equivalent to only 2.8% of the GDP, while it is 14.7% for Singapore, 8.3% for Thailand, 6.2% for Malaysia, 4.9% for Vietnam, and 3.7% for Indonesia. Our neighbors apparently are more serious than us about recovering from this global health emergency, even if we actually have the highest mortality rate from the disease in the region. The Philippines was not exactly known to be working on income and wealth inequality coming into the pandemic. On the contrary, over time, we had one of the most skewed income distributions in the region, with 66% of the families earning below $438 a month, and another 29% between that high range and $1,250 per month. This is while 0.04% of the families, the super rich, have monthly income of over $1 million. The already little and precarious incomes of the majority collapsed during the military implemented lockdown, which is to be running now to be one of the longest and harshest in the world. Millions of jobs were lost. Savings, if there were any to begin with, of millions of households were wiped out, and millions of people slid into hunger and poverty. And as though these were not enough, we are now faced with generalized inflation in foodstuff and other basic commodities, as supply mechanics and, in our context, unscrupulous monopoly trading practices prey on the hapless consumers. Meanwhile, Forbes reports that the Philippines' 50 richest individuals saw their collective wealth fall 22% due to the pandemic, with 32 of them experiencing decline in net worth. How bad could that be? These are billionaires and will remain billionaires even if government continues the lockdown. These are the super rich who actually should have paid their taxes well, so our government could have the money to spend on the poor and vulnerable. But it does not happen that way, which leads us to believe that addressing inequality is really about political will. The Duterte administration has been penny pinching with emergency relief amounting to only 25 cents per person per day in the duration of the first 3.5 months of lockdown. This meager amount even came quite late and in a chaotic manner. And the government also canceled the second tranche for a lot of recipients in the succeeding months. The Duterte administration underestimates the recession, and that's an understatement, and the entire urgent need to provide relief to a large section of the population. But it has gone on quite a borrowing binge, such that by the end of its term in 2022, it would have borrowed as much as the combined borrowings of the 5 previous administrations. And this is not exactly for its COVID response, nor for stimulating aggregate demand. It is borrowing for the sake of boosting its credit worthiness, to fund its infrastructure program, to stimulate construction business and real estate, some of the main sources of wealth of the local billionaires, and to provide infrastructure to foreign investors. There is also that self-interest of lining the pockets of politicians and commissioning bureaucrats. And irony of all ironies, the Duterte government is providing corporate income tax cuts and forgoes precious revenues to further encourage big local and foreign business. Now, another irony is about to unfold as our government joins the vaccine race, yet does not budget for its procurement, but only intends to borrow more and to rely on the private sector to provide inoculation. It engages in very untransparent procurement process and privileges the military and the rich. The poor and the middle class will bear the burden of all this insensitivity through irrecoverable jobs and incomes, rising prices, more health and education expenses, marginalization from free vaccination, and the continued spread of COVID-19. We from the global south may have the same context and proposals at this point, but perhaps not. It has been a year after all. But would you believe we still do not have decent triage management? Our government has refused to do mass testing, isolation and quarantine, and treatment. It has only done a militarized and much politicized COVID response rather than scientific and rational containment measures. No wonder we have not contained coronavirus. At any rate, we are similar in wanting to address the tenacious inequality in our different contexts, and our proposals should be a resounding urgent calls for our governments to, one, provide substantial and long-term income and livelihood assistance and economic stimulus for the poor and the vulnerable, and two, wage and employment subsidy for the displaced, three, price freeze and control for food and basic needs, and lastly, and fourth, to strengthen our public health systems and social services. And finally, our governments must have the political resolve to tax the rich. Even a 1% tax on the wealth of the world's billionaires can raise valuable funds to recover lost vast livelihoods. We need to break the barriers of social distancing and isolation to collectively call for these urgent proposals. For after all, addressing inequality will start from social solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosario, Rose, because you have done quite well. You did very well with the time, and I hope the others will follow the same example. And thank you very much for the input you have put here right now. But those with the questions to you can still collect them, and then after the presentation of of Justin, then we can have a good discussion there. So now we welcome Dr. Justin to speak on in a time of pandemic tax justice now. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Regata. I'm going to share my screen, so I hope you will all be able to see this, and then we can begin. Okay, hopefully you can see that.
Yes.
Someone give me a shout if you can't. So thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to the important discussion that we're going to have today. As has been said, I work for a United Kingdom organization, Church Action for Tax Justice. And as we all know, coronavirus is having an untold medical, social, and economic impact across the world. And as such, it's imperative that we think through how we might respond as a range of organizations committed to an economy of life. As you will have appreciated, I am a white man from a very rich country. I occupy multiple dimensions of privilege. I recognize that. Unfortunately, it seems to me that many of my fellow country people in the United Kingdom don't see themselves in that way. In fact, this is how many in Europe like to think of themselves as the generous, there we go, as the generous bestowers of gifts to the rest of the world. However, as of course we all know, this kind of headline here is far from the real picture. For the real picture is that for many years, the global north has in fact been stealing from the global south for centuries and continues to do so today. I've just finished reading a historical account of the East India Company and the way that it used British military might to deprive a sovereign nation of, in one estimate, $45 trillion. And a similar, perhaps even more shocking tale could be told of our exploits in sub-Saharan Africa, where the slave trade didn't just deprive the continent of millions of lives, but at the same time use those lives to build the economic might of the British Empire. Of course, such injustices are not merely limited to the colonial era, but have continued into the present. Even if it weren't for coronavirus, we in the global north owe the global south for what we are continuing to do in respect of fueling climate change, demanding debt servicing. And in this way, I've often talked about the fact when I talk about these issues that we are not net contributors to the global south from the UK, but we are net takers. And as such, even when we do give aid, as we like to pride ourselves on, we're at best merely returning stolen goods. However, in the brief time I have, I want to offer a particular focus on the issue of tax justice, and that is what I now intend to do. Just this week, Oxfam released their latest inequality report with a particular focus on the impact of coronavirus. Here are some of the findings that Oxfam made. We know that COVID has increased poverty across the globe as economies have stagnated, investments dried up, and consumer demand plummeted. According to one estimate, 200 million people have lost their jobs as a result of COVID globally. But while many of them will take more than a decade to recover financially, those people who've lost their jobs, it has taken just 9 months for the world's billionaires to return to their pre-pandemic levels of wealth. At the same time, others have done extremely well out of the crisis. Oxfam estimate that the increase in wealth of the 10 richest has been more than enough to pay for a vaccine for everyone and still have room left over to stop anyone falling into poverty. And if you think about it, that I think is remarkable. We are simply talking here about the growth in wealth for some individuals. At the start of the pandemic, the world was already a very unequal place, with just 22 men owning the same wealth as all the women in Africa. And yet COVID has made things so much worse. It has and is driving up inequality between nations, within nations, between men and women, between different ethnic groups, and between generations. And the impact on the poorest will be felt for decades. As numerous commentators have said, we might all be in the same storm, but we are definitely not in the same boat. So how is this possible? How is it that such an unfair and unjust economic system can operate, and what can we do about it? Well, of course, there are many explanations for the unequal impact of COVID, but at least part of the problem relates to the issue I'll focus on, tax justice. And interestingly, this problem takes us back to the colonial era I've already mentioned. Vanessa Rogel has written extensively on what she has called archipelago capitalism. She describes how tax havens emerged at the end of the colonial era, effectively as a place for white settlers to stash their money as they realized colonial power was decreasing. And what that means is that wealth that really belongs to Tanzania or India or Sierra Leone is in fact hidden away in the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, or Bermuda, all of which, incidentally, are British overseas territories. This is archipelago capitalism. Now, moreover, having discovered this lucrative way of stealing from former colonies, the multinational corporations that emerged as a result have continued this plunder. On one estimate, up to $18 trillion is sitting in tax havens today, and around $200 billion is lost each year to global South countries through tax dodging by multinationals. And that 200 billion per year is significantly more than is given in aid to those countries. But the crucial point is that this is $200 billion that is money that is effectively being stolen, I think, from the global South. It's 200 billion that could be used to put children in school, to fund healthcare, to build roads and bridges, or to pay for the distribution of vaccines. But it's instead funding the luxury lifestyles of some tax haven resident. So what can we do about this? Well, I want to suggest 4 things. Firstly, as many of you will know, the global tax rules that allow this kind of tax dodging to take place are currently being negotiated at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, as part of what is called the BEPS process. And I've spelt out the acronym on the slide. And as you'll be aware, the OECD is the club for rich countries. And while they claim that these negotiations are taking place under an inclusive framework of 135 countries, the reality is that negotiations are being dominated by the wealthier countries. This was actually made very clear in a public consultation just a week or so ago, when they effectively stated that they were waiting to see what the line would be from the new US administration. And what struck me about that, because of the new elections there, but what struck me is that I can't imagine, for instance, that they'd have said the same about Bolivia, who also held elections this year. The first thing then that can be done is that these negotiations on the global tax rules could move to a truly representative international body, namely the UN. Now, the UN's not perfect, but it's far more representative and democratic than the OECD. Secondly, my organization, plus many others, are campaigning that these global tax rules are reformed in such a way that they prioritize the needs of global South countries. As I've indicated, tax dodging hurts the economies of the global South to a much greater extent than the economies of the global North. And in reforming the rules, the needs of the global South countries should be at the forefront of the negotiations. And incidentally, this was a point made by the Jamaican finance minister just yesterday in his contribution to the discussions. And in practice, that would mean taxing multinationals at the level of their global consolidated profits, in combination with an effective minimum tax rate, maybe of around 25%. Now, that's not the current proposal on the table. And together with others, we are seeking to get that changed. If it was changed, the era of tax havens would end. Thirdly, we need to see the introduction of full country-by-country reporting. At present, corporations can hide, to some extent, where they make their profits and where they pay their taxes. Full disclosure, country by country, could stop this. And maybe we're beginning to see some voices in support of that proposal. And finally, and especially in light of COVID, I think we need to see the introduction of an excess profits tax. As I've indicated, many corporations have made huge profits from COVID. Online retailers are an obvious example, but no one should profit from COVID. And we need to introduce an excess profits tax, maybe of at least 75%, to claw back some of that unnatural gain. In that way, Global South countries could retain much more of the resources that are actually theirs, and so be able to fund the healthcare and poverty reduction measures that are so badly needed. Having said all of that, perhaps I can just finish with this. Tax justice is not, at the end of the day, about, I think, statistics or numbers, although they're very important, and I've thrown a lot at you in this talk. It's about people. It's about people like my friend Charity, who works as a translator in a hospital in Uganda, serving her patients on a daily basis, yet earning so little that she can't always afford the school and medical fees that she needs. She shouldn't have to struggle in that way. Her hospital shouldn't have to struggle, and her country shouldn't have to struggle. And a better, fairer global tax system could be part of the solution to all that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justin. You also was just exactly on the point. Thank you very much, and very good presentation there. I think we have a good food for thought. I saw actually people asking for your presentations, also the first one and the second. The question is whether everybody wants to have your presentation. So I think Stanley, on the other side of the Oikotree, maybe they should send it there, and then we shall give it to everybody.
He has already shared. We will send it to everybody.
Very good. So thank you very much. Now it is a time for giving about 10 minutes for questioning. And if there's a little to add there in time, then we can add some more minutes before we allow the others to present. What are the questions posed for, let's say, just any of them right now? We are inviting questions. I don't see the questions being written there except the demand for the presentations.
I think there's one question in the chat box. Regatta, would you like me to respond to it?
Yeah, can you respond to that one, please?
Yeah, thank you. This is, I'm not sure the email address of the name of the individual. What a great question. I think one of the most useful resources actually is a resource on the website of Tax Justice Network. They have very recently produced a State of Tax Justice report. But what's fantastic, it's a kind of interactive website. After I've spoken, I'll put the link in the chat box, where you can put in your own country. And what you can do is you can put in your own country, and it will bring up data on the degree of tax dodging, the amount of money that is leaving your country and where it's going to. I mean, so you can sort of simply put in your own country, see the amount that's going, and Tax Justice Network have confirmed that they're going to repeat this exercise once a year. So I think that's a great place for you to be able to monitor how much money is leaving the country that shouldn't be.
Okay, good. I have a question for you, Justin. Being a moderator, I'm not supposed really to speak much, but the question is, the good proposals you made, which mechanism in the global system or structure where they can be articulated for action?
You mean how could which mechanism could they actually happen through?
Yes.
Well, ideally, it should be the UN. There's been a number of calls for a UN tax commission from Global South countries and from civil society campaigners. I think the real key here is the OECD. So, and we know that the OECD is influenced by its member governments. So from my point of view here in the United Kingdom, we at Church Action for Tax Justice, and I should say incidentally just in passing, the founder of my organization is on this call, David Haslam, folks will see him there. But we at Church Action for Tax Justice are trying to lobby our own parliament around this issue. So, for instance, we had a debate in our House of Lords just last week on precisely this issue. So we're trying to persuade our own government to move the discussions from the OECD to the UN. Now, Britain doesn't have that power alone, but it's about momentum, isn't it? And I mean, if that became the British view, it might extend to the European view. We need to wait and see what the Biden administration is. Failing that, and listening to the most recent negotiations, the OECD is planning to plow ahead. What we can hope for is that the OECD itself comes up with a fairer outcome. And so that's the kind of the other tack. We're saying, look, even if you don't move the negotiations to the UN, can you at least ensure you prioritize the needs of lower income countries in the outcome that we're due to see in July? Now, of course, there's powerful lobby groups, especially from business, who don't want to see that outcome. But we can hope that that's what might happen. And again, we in UK are pressurizing our government. Other individuals will need to pressurize their own governments to go in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a question to Rose. In the Philippines, how much is the problem due to the Duterte government? And also, they are saying that the Financial Times of today carries an article saying Duterte is still very popular. How come, Rosaria?
The problem, we can focus in the last maybe couple of months during the pandemic, just to quantify how much of our economic collapse, which is the worst since the Second World War, they say. It was released yesterday, the GDP growth rate, when we have the worst contraction after World War II. So let's just focus on that period and say how much of that problem or of that collapse is really due to the Duterte government. And I would say it's really it made a lot of weight that the government did not respond rationally to COVID and did not use science, and it was really it was very irrational by not spending so much to respond to the health crisis and also to stimulate aggregate demand. So I already talked about that. Yes, we have an underlying crisis, which is our long-time crisis. Yes, we have, before the pandemic, our economy was already slowing down for 3 years in a row. And that was already a sign because of the interest rates already going up elsewhere. So our growth episode was almost over before the pandemic. But when COVID happened, everything really collapsed. And it's because the Duterte government, number one, refused to look at the problems. It continued burying its head in the sand, and just thinking of how to survive, even not just the pandemic, but the decline in popularity, which brings me to the next question. The next question is that the Financial Times, actually today also, Standard and Poor's said in a very fantastic projection that the Philippine economy, having the worst contraction in Southeast Asia, will have the best recovery ever in 2021. So it's really, where is that coming from? From S&P, from Standard and Poor's. And we should say that it's also part of the obsession with credit worthiness, that even credit ratings agencies will make up these fantastic projections and say, yes, Philippines, go, you can do it, yes, Duterte, you're still popular and you can do it. But that's just boosting the confidence of a government that's still willing to accept declining global capital or global investments. And the other answer, the other answer to the question that why is it still popular? Actually, if you look at media and social media, you can look at the algorithm of why people still believe in the president, or you can also look into the methodology of surveys that say that Duterte is still popular. And I don't have really a very straight answer to that question.
Okay, Rosario, you have quite some other two questions here. One is, does the Anti-Terror Act impact the COVID-related economics when human rights defenders are being red tagged and vilified on a daily basis? And then from Jim Davis, there's a question there, which is, any marginal hope that with the Biden administration, the Duterte regime may be called to account for inequality and human rights abuses? I think some
Okay.
of these questions seem to be
Yeah.
unfair.
Just a short response to the anti-terrorism law that was passed at the height of the lockdown and the pandemic, as though terrorism is the problem, the main problem at that time. But actually, of course, people not just locally but even globally looked at it as the Duterte administration shooting down uh, criticisms and dissent at the height of its incompetence to address the pandemic. Um, but yes, the irony of this is that the activists, or even not just the human rights defenders, but the development workers who have gone out of their way to provide relief to the vulnerable, or even to people who did not get any economic relief during the pandemic, were even imprisoned or red tagged or accused by the military of being communist, or of being breaking health protocols and all that. So the question, how does the act impact on the economy? It's really, it has an impact on sane response, or um, on development work, in the sense that it has constricted civic space, and it has curtailed even civil society organizations who would want to really do their part in responding to COVID. So I think that's a short answer to that. With regard to the Biden administration, actually we are observing the relationship from our end, which is from the Duterte administration's end, and we are seeing here again siding or going back to the arms of the US in terms of foreign relations between US and the Philippines, but at the same time having lukewarm relationship now with China. So it's still a choice between US and China for the Duterte administration. I don't know with the Biden administration if there is ever move to make Duterte accountable for its crimes against humanity. That is yet to be seen. But as of now, we are seeing that the support of the US militarily and economically continues, and actually has increased over time.
Okay, thank you very much. We have actually finished the first 10 open questions for people to discuss. And now I see some of the questions which might arise on the chat. I think the speakers can start to also respond to them if they come more later. But let us allow the next speaker to come in order for them to take their 10 minutes each, and then we shall come back again to another discussion. And it's not only limited to the last two, but the whole thing, okay? If you agree, then I want to invite Dr. Kav to speak on the pandemic and climate change, lessons for climate change. So Dr. Kav,
thank you.
You have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me to present in this very diverse international audience. So let me start off by drawing some comparisons or rather similarities between climate change and the pandemic that we are facing today, which is actually one of the pandemics. Potentially more such events are likely to happen in the future because of certain conditions that we have created. And both of these crises link back to imperialism, which morphed into globalization, which then spread the accelerated industrialization across the world, which depends on consumption of fossil energy. And that is where the roots of climate change lie. What this whole process also did is uncontrolled urbanization, and it globalized our food systems, food production systems, as well as trade in food, which is one of the triggers for increased proximity between various animal species and humans, and also creating unhygienic conditions in food production systems, even on small and marginalized farms, because of the pressure of increasing production. All of this has increased the proximity between animals and humans, which is allowing various viruses to jump from animals to humans and triggering off all these new diseases. And then what starts as an epidemic in one part of the world, because the world is now so well connected, with travelers flying around everywhere, it doesn't take long for an epidemic to become a pandemic, which is a worldwide epidemic. And that's the reason why many people believe that as we keep on eroding the world's biodiversity and ecosystems, such instances of, I mean, basically, we are increasing the chances for viruses to migrate to human populations, and therefore, the chances of similar pandemics arising again and again are much higher now than it used to be the case before. So in that sense, we are in a sense in a period where, on one hand, climate change, which was triggered off the moment in Europe the first coal and petroleum use started, the impacts have only started appearing a few decades ago, and now we are actually see it unfolding around us. And this higher possibility of pandemics is coinciding with that. So in a way, these two things are going hand in hand and are in that way rooted in the same basic causes. And these are the also the problems, these are also the causes which have created the social inequity that we see across the world. We are on one hand here talked a bit about how the developed countries are sort of enriching themselves more, and thereby impacting the developing countries. But the same inequality and the same injustices are within each developing country also, and also, of course, in the developed countries too, but more so in the developing countries, where the gap between the rich and poor is getting wider and starker. And the lack of awareness in general is much more. So that is also another important point to consider. So when we are talking about social justice, it's not just an international issue, but it is a within country issue also for many developing countries. Interestingly, in the case of the COVID pandemic, it became a pandemic because of international travelers, essentially, who are, majority of them are the rich and the upper middle class across the world. But the health impacts have been more severe for the poor and the marginalized. In India and in many developing countries, it's the urban poor who have been hit the most, because they are living in congested settlements with very unhygienic conditions, and therefore it has been impossible to stop the spread of the virus in these settlements. This is a case where the population group which has created the problem has suffered relatively less, whereas those who haven't really contributed to creating the problem are the ones suffering the most. Exactly the same case is there with climate change. Climate change is caused by consumption of fossil energy, and fossil energy, the maximum consumption of fossil energy is happening to sustain the lifestyles of the rich and upper middle classes. But the impacts of climate change are being suffered by the poor, the marginalized, rural populations, tribal populations, and so on. So, therefore, the way the response to the pandemic unfolded uh, gives important lessons to how we should be responding to the crisis of climate change. Now, across the world, the one thing which has been done by all the governments is shutting down the economy, because that was seen as the only way to stop people from coming in contact with each other, and therefore stopping the spread of the virus when we didn't have any defenses against it. And of course, that had the biggest impact for those who have a hand to mouth existence, because everybody lost money, but for the middle class and the richer people, there is some financial cushion to be able to sustain even if the economy is shut down, whereas for those who don't have that cushion are going to suffer the most. The uh, the, the interesting part here is that none of the governments across the world seem to have anticipated this, and that is what makes it a very severe social justice issue, according to me. What various governments did after the fact, who gave more assistance and who gave less assistance, is a different discussion altogether. But my question really is for everyone to introspect on, is that how come nobody anticipated the severe impacts this is likely to have for the poor and tried to trigger some response to that anticipated impact, to those crises? So that is something, that's a question that one needs to ask and also introspect on. I can speak from the Indian context that we saw some unprecedented scenes here in our country when the entire country was locked down. um, Thousands of people basically who were migrants from rural areas and working in the cities lost their livelihood overnight. There was nothing really to support them. Nothing was put in place by the government, since everybody was locked down. Even the civil society organizations couldn't do much, and thousands of people just realized that there is nothing left for them to stay where they are, and they started walking back to their homes. Those were really unprecedented scenes, and what it did is that it uh, sort of made this entire urban poor community suddenly visible to all the middle class and rich people in the cities. Once these people left, it suddenly came as a eureka moment for many people that, oh, these are the people who run our cities, and it's because of them that our lifestyles are sustained, which was never acknowledged before. So suddenly that realization has come up, and we see that reflected interestingly in commercial advertisements, but not in government policies. We are suddenly seeing a lot of advertisements of products which show rich people being kind to poor people, but the policies still remain the same. But I mean, these are interesting social effects, side effects that we are seeing of this phenomenon. However, what this has sort of exposed, that the pandemic had its own health impacts for the poor, which revealed the lack of healthcare services for the poor, for the rural populations also. And the solution for the pandemic, the supposed solution for the pandemic, also impacted the poor, which revealed the very myopic urban development policies, the unplanned growth of cities, which is plaguing India and other developing countries also. And I believe that addressing both of these issues is very important, both for dealing with future pandemics and for dealing with climate change. Uh, Again, in the case of climate change, also the poor are more vulnerable, and therefore being healthier is going to increase their chances of surviving the impacts of climate change also, because you need to adapt to changing environmental conditions. You need to be flexible to change your livelihood options. So being strong mentally and physically is important, and therefore nutrition and health care for everyone is actually important for people to develop their own inner strength to deal with climate change impacts. So that is number one. Secondly, cities in the developing countries are becoming hugely vulnerable to climate change impacts because of natural disasters, because of the economic swings that will come as the fossil fuel prices fluctuate, and the migration, because climate change will also create mass migration and people will naturally flock to centers of economy. All of this churning is going to impact cities, and therefore urban planning is going to be critically important in our response to climate change. And unless urban planning is socially just, it is not going to create the right kind of a robust system which will allow us to deal with these problems. So these, I think, are the two lessons that we have learned from the pandemic, that we need to address our healthcare lacunas in our healthcare systems, and we need to seriously reconsider the urban development policies in our countries. These two things will be useful even in dealing with climate change. So I'll stop there.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much,
very much.
Dr. Priya, for that very informative, and especially the migration part, which is given a lot of attention as well, where we have studies already showing that it will be one of the biggest problems by the year 2030. So I think it's a very, very pertinent issue there. Now we are coming to the last but not least speaker, who is Joy Kennedy. And Joy Kennedy will speak to us on building back for more climate justice. So Joy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Regate. And friends, good to be here. I'm going to share my screen. I can do this here. I want to start by something that we do now as regular practice in Canada, and that is to acknowledge the land, those who have guarded this land and preserved this land for millennia. We have learned that it is important to acknowledge that we live now on what were stolen lands. And here in my city, Takaranto or Toronto, we particularly acknowledge the peoples of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the prevailing populations of Indigenous peoples here today, including Métis and Inuit. So this is a way to acknowledge our colonial past and the kind of reconciliation that we're moving forward in. So what I want to share with you are some principles for just recovery. When the pandemic hit, by the end of March, we realized as civil society movements in this country of Canada that we had to come together. There was, we needed to articulate among ourselves and then for the rest of the country, the kind of values and principles that could help us move forward toward a recovery that wouldn't be business as usual, but that would be just and sustainable. And so a few hundred of us got together. It was through the miracles of technology, and started using Slack, which was an interesting experience for some of us. And within about 6 weeks, jointly wrote a set of principles that we hoped we could build policy and advocacy acts upon. We realized that the interconnected issues of the pandemic, of health, of poverty, of marginalization, of international inequities and of climate change could not be viewed in isolation. They had to be viewed together. And so what we did was create a set of 6 principles. Now, internationally, there were a set of principles people had started working on for just recovery. There were 4 or 5, depending on where you lived. But in Canada, we insisted that one of the key principles would have to be around Indigenous rights. And so we created a set of 6. Now, as it rolled along, we realized that, you know, our favorite son, Leonard Cohen, would sing about cracks, and that's how the light gets in. So we acknowledged the cracks and tried to let the light get in for us to be able to articulate what building back better would look like. So now, as we've gone through this, we have somewhere around 600 organizations that have agreed that we must be addressing in an integrated way the results of chronic underinvestment and inaction in the face of the ongoing pre-existing crises of colonialism, of human rights abuses, of social inequity, ecological degradation, and climate change. And now this COVID crisis is forcing governments and civil society alike to reckon with the inadequacies and inequities of our systems. This is the moment. This is the moment where we stand on a threshold between the old world and the next, and we must choose to build the future we want. So to keep me in time, I am going to go through these principles a bit because I have to move something here. Okay, here we go. To build a movement, we realize nothing's going to change except from bottom up. The leadership has been inadequate, and we know we can't go back to business as usual, so we're building a movement that puts people first. First of all, because it's a health crisis, immediately, put people's health and well-being first. No exceptions, because health is a human right, and it's interdependent with the health and well-being of ecological systems. So the kind of policies that we would argue for and advocate for are about things like, well, not just emergency work, but long-term care has been the hardest hit. People with pre-existing medical conditions have been hardest hit. We have to learn from this pandemic to put investment to keep communities and workplaces, particularly those on the front lines, safe. Secondly, to strengthen the social safety net and provide relief directly to people, like directly, not through, you know, we need basic income, for example. Prioritize redistributive policies and social service meeting immediate and long-term needs of all people, and eliminate social, economic, and wealth inequalities. Rebuild a single-tier immigration system with permanent resident status for all. We realize that, in fact, as someone else said, that the cities and the farmlands and healthcare are so dependent on migrants that who were not able to have status. So that has to be dealt with in an equitable and fair way. Prioritize the needs of workers and communities. Well, support has to be distributed in a manner consistent with Indigenous sovereignty, climate resilient economy, and worker rights, including safe and fair labor standards and a right to unionize. The unions have been under real threat, you know, so that's, in this time, it's been very important to uphold that right. Need improved conditions for essential service workers and maintain those beyond this crisis. So bailout packages everybody talked about just recovery having bailout packages, but they can't be to encourage unqualified handouts to CEOs, regulatory rollbacks, or regressive subsidies that only enrich the already rich, particularly those taking advantage of tax havens, as we've heard previously. So these programs must support a just transition away from fossil fuels. We are in a climate emergency as well, and let's realize now is the moment to transition quickly from fossil fuels and create decent work, leaving no one behind. Then building resilience to prevent future crises. Well, we can't recover from the current crisis by entrenching systems that already cause it and that will cause the next one. So we must invest in sustainable infrastructure and build resiliency within communities, ensuring that people can access public essential services, meet their basic needs, and engage in cultural and artistic expression. You know, the arts community have been hard hit by COVID because, you know, venues are not open for them. And then finally, almost finally, to build solidarity and equity across communities, generations, and borders. Because in a globalized world, what happens to one of us matters to all of us. That includes international equity and gender equity and opposing authoritarian regimes and oppressive systems. And finally, to uphold Indigenous rights and work in partnership with Indigenous peoples. As particularly around the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in line with free, prior, and informed consent. Now, just one more thing I want to share with you, and that is in the Climate Action Network. I chair the Climate Action Network of Canada. And one of the things we realized is that if we're going to incorporate these principles, we need to be thinking about what does Canada's fair share look like in terms of the climate crisis. And so we worked on the principle of equity and participatory democracy to identify what would Canada's climate fair share look like to limit 1.5. So we had experts crunch all the numbers and realized that our fair share would be actually to have to reduce emissions by a total of 140% below 2005 levels by 2030. Now, how is that possible? Well, at least 60% of that would be done immediately at home, but 80% of it would be international by supporting international initiatives, including climate finance, that Canada is a rich country, has capacity, and that unless we contribute to the international global solutions for climate change, we're perpetuating our colonial mentality. And so we've worked really hard at this part and have been advocating with the government for policies that will do this. And we're now looking at a bill in Parliament that is about climate accountability that includes this, this fair share component. So that's one of the ways we decided to roll out, among many other things, these just principles for building back better for a very just recovery, an inclusive, sustainable, and just recovery. So I'll leave it there. Those pieces are available online at justrecoveryforall.ca. And it's a formula, but 600 organizations have now supported this and are using it in where, whether they're health organizations, labor, Indigenous groups, faith communities, and basically pretty much all of civil society.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joey, for the principles of just recovery and many other things which you mentioned there. I found out that we have actually touched the basic things about equality, inequity, equity, and the way to save our planet, we have discussed all these things. Now we need also to a little bit go into the area like you mentioned on the alternative side. How do we change things? I think that is one is all the time coming back to us as the movements to see how we bring new things. Now, as you say, the threshold, where do we go from now? I would like now to welcome a discussion again for the last pieces which have been presented for people to raise questions. So far in the box, I have not seen yet one, but people can ask questions right there where you are.
I see one that David has put in, asking about working with Indigenous peoples in resisting further development in the tar sands, and I would say pipelines also, and Biden's cancellation of Keystone, a positive. Yeah, so there are initiatives now around things like looking at global frameworks for non-proliferation of fossil fuels. We had a webinar on that yesterday. And yes, looking at, and Indigenous peoples are right in the front lines of the resistance. You can think of Standing Rock, for example, which many of you would have heard of in the States, but similar in Canada. And our partners are with the Indigenous Climate Action Network. So yes, absolutely working together. It's very interesting. We're watching closely what happens south of the border here in terms of the impact on Canadian government policy, but the dance is on. At least we're dancing now together, whereas in the previous 4 years, it was, yeah, a horror story, shall we say. But Indigenous peoples have been in the forefront of these resistance to fossil fuel expansion for decades now, and and we need to learn from their leadership and join in together, and we have been critical.
Okay. Are there some other questions to Joy or to Priya? Because as you can see, there was quite a good presentation, like it's the first part of the two. They were talking about economics and the issues of income and inequality in that area of livelihoods, etc., exploitation going on under the pandemic, which has been even more intensified at the moment. The second part has been actually our climate and how it affects and has already exposed vulnerability even sharper at this time. And this is how we were going that rhythm of presentation, I think. So yes, I think that is a question from David.
Yeah, I wondered if I could ask Priya in this context about the Indian government's coal policy, because it's still wanted to exploit the coal deposits and develop those. And people say to us, it's all very well you in the West wanting to stop India's exploitation of coal, because we've been exploiting coal for the last 300 years, so we've created the climate problem. What right do we have to say to India, you should stop funding the coal industry? I'd just be interested in your comments on that, especially in the economic context, because of course India does need development, and fuel, obviously, energy is part of that development.
Yeah, that's true in a sense, and there was a time when that argument would make sense, where actually it was cheaper to invest in coal-based energy. But the economics of renewable energy has changed over the years, and partly the whole enthusiasm about everybody now wanting to increase the share of renewables in the energy mix is related to the fact that it is actually now more economically wiser to invest in renewables than in coal. So from that perspective itself, that argument has now become a bit weaker, that we must develop and therefore we have to continue to use coal. The other aspect of it is, as was also said earlier, that we have seen this coal based system and the kind of economic system it has created and the kind of problems it has created. Why do we then want to continue making the same mistakes when new technologies actually show us a different path? Decentralized renewables combined with rationalizing energy use uh, allows us actually will allow us to decouple our what you can say quality of life of citizens from use of fossil energy, because GDP and everything is, these are meaningless parameters. What is more important is what is the quality of life of the citizens. And there are now enough case studies which show that using decentralized renewables, you don't actually need to increase your income levels, etc., etc., but you can still create a good quality of life in an equitable manner for the citizens. So why not take that path is a question that many of us, the civil society organizations, keep pushing our government with. Unfortunately, the fossil fuel, the petroleum lobby interests, and in general, the traditional industry interests are far, far stronger than everybody else. So it's really a power struggle rather than anything else there.
Priya, there is a question from Martina, which is saying, are the ongoing farmer protests in India also
Mhm.
linked to climate change impacts?
Um, well, it is linked more with the globalization of food trade, I guess, because the entire control of food market is going in the hands of a few corporates, and that is the fear which is making the farmers wary of these new proposed changes, because it opens the door for those possibilities getting enacted there. The climate change impacts are coming in the agricultural sector, definitely in India, and are impacting farmers in really a bad way. I mean, on top of this, this pandemic has added another blow to them. So that is a different issue altogether. The current fight with the government that is going on doesn't really reflect that issue, but that's just waiting around the corner, I would say, because the agricultural sector is really getting hit very badly. But that impact currently is being felt more among the rain-fed and marginalized farmers who are not as organized to create this kind of a long-term well-planned resistance. So voices are being raised in different parts of the country, but not in a very concerted and coordinated way as far as the climate change impacts is concerned.
Okay, another is Philip Woods appreciates you are introducing urban planning as an issue, but he says too often it is used against marginal communities. How can it be used as a tool for poverty eradication?
Um, so, and that is why I said that we need urban planning which is rooted in social justice. Today, what happens is urban planners are only thinking of how will we increase GDP generation from the cities by building more and more infrastructure. So, I have personally been involved in a study where we looked at how the urbanization is happening in India, and we figured out that we need to set certain limits based on the ecosystem realities around each geographical location of each city, because as far as possible the city should be able to sustain itself on the resources that are available in its neighborhood, and circular economy principles should be used for planning the city. Today what is happening is that the cities have become parasites. They are taking resources from everywhere and then putting all their pollution and waste in the same places, and also disenfranchising people in the way they are expanding. So all of that needs to change, and the development and of the cities should be linked with the ecosystem limits. That's one thing. Secondly, the climate change imperatives of that location, both from the perspective of how much emissions you are putting in the atmosphere, and also what kind of climate vulnerabilities exist for that location. So for example, coastal cities just should not be growing much at this point in time. So those realities also have to be taken into consideration, and the social inequities. So one suggestion that we have been making is that now that there is this sudden realization that the labor of the poor is necessary for keeping the city running, therefore it is the city's responsibility to provide housing and basic services to those poor people, and do not expect them to buy it at market rates. So those kind of policies and developing those kind of settlements at the city level can be a step towards creating that social equity. Uh, so basically, it's a matter of change in mindset and change in thinking. Once that happens, then things will start changing. That's what we believe.
Could I just put a tag on that? Just say that there's a great organization called the C40, which is an organization
Yeah,
of the largest
that's
cities
right.
in the world,
Yeah,
who are looking at how to actually build back better
yeah,
for more climate resilience, for more equity, for really walking through this portal or this threshold
right.
into a new way of understanding how we think about buildings, how we think about transportation, how we think about how we plan for really a renewed, greened world. And that leaves no one behind, because that provides jobs for people who, in the transition from fossil fuels, for example, good jobs in retrofits, in in all manner of urban renewal. Renewal is not the right word. It's really reinventing how we
Yeah, yes.
live
Okay.
together in
Okay.
uh,
I
in
think
this.
we have our time is almost over, and we have had a lot of input and nice discussion, and we still have questions which could not be answered. But we next time we have to raise the issues of G20, IFIs. This is Jim Davis who is reminding us, and the issues of cancellation of debt, because there is a lot of accumulation of debt at this particular time in our countries because of the pandemic as well. So these are the issues which are not really, have not found space to speak about them now, but next time then. But I would like then to take the opportunity to thank all of you for the good input. And I think those inputs which have been sent to us, they will be shared by everybody. And actually, let us all be together in the networking, in the movements to bring about change in the world. So thank you very much.